Well, good evening, and thanks again for joining us in this book study of an important subject on suffering. Tim Keller's book, Walking with God Through Pain and Suffering. It's actually a class we taught here, and you may notice where we're at this evening is we're here at the church, and it's typically pretty quiet around here. Being here is kind of weird when there's no one here, but thankfully there's a few other people here, and I appreciate Ms. Kim helping me with Shep right now safely from a distance. Also, we're going to have our first in-person interview tonight, and that will be done with safe measures as well. But just felt like this was an appropriate class to put out to you. We've wanted to do a whole preaching series on suffering, and knew that would not be something people want to hear a whole lot about. But so many of you are suffering. I know some of you are right there in the front lines. Some of you have loved ones now who have tested positive, and as well, a lot of you are now experiencing furlough. So whether you're acutely feeling suffering at the moment or just feeling inconvenience, it is so important for us to have a theology. And I cannot recommend this book enough. So let's start and begin, and remember how to do this, and share my screen with you. And this week, what we're going to look at is, here we go. What we're looking at this week is the suffering of God, and that these two things are challenging for us. Is that God is sovereign, and yet He allows suffering to come into our lives and into those He created. His whole creation has been subjected to this reality, and that is so troubling for so many of us. And it's hard to reconcile, but I think what's so important for us to understand this week, we're going to focus exclusively on God's suffering. It's one thing if you have a God who says, well, I'm holy and you've sinned, and so now you're going to suffer, and that's just the way it is. But the reality is He suffers. And His heart is moved by our suffering. And so critical for us to see these things. And so one of the things we mentioned last week is that, even apart from sin and evil, this is a direct quote from Tim Keller himself, we would never have seen the courage of God or the astonishing extent of His love, the glory of a deity who lays aside His glory and goes to the cross. And, in the Garden of Eden, if Adam and Eve had never sinned, there still would be this remaining question, and I think I mentioned this either in the pulpit or in the class last week, that we would not know what cost God was willing to pay to love us at our worst. But because of the cross, we now know that God has entered into our suffering. He has suffered cosmically in levels we'll never ever have to or ever even understand, maybe until we get to glory. But also we can see that He's not indifferent, and He has taken on suffering Himself, and we see that shows us how much He loves us. And so want to make the case here that because of God, so sovereignty and suffering are two things that we need to hold together that coexist. If God was not sovereign, and evil and some other power had greater power over Him, so Jesus comes into the world and He suffers, but God is not sovereign, then that's actually not something He's willingly doing. It's not a volunteering, He's not volunteering to do it, because that would just simply mean, I know this is a bit up there, but if God is not sovereign and He then has to suffer, then He's just going through it because something's greater than Him. But on the other hand, if He's sovereign, but He doesn't suffer, then we have a God who is indifferent then, and is not willingly taking on something that His own creation is having to deal with. But because of the suffering servant talked about throughout the Old Testament, and we'll see in just a little bit, and in a couple of weeks as well when we cover the Emmaus Road passage, a hard concept for his people to have even understood that he would have to suffer. But because he has willingly chosen to suffer, then that means it's an act of love. Because he's sovereign, he didn't have to suffer. He's not being subjected to a force greater than him, but he's willingly putting himself into our world and suffering on our behalf. So we have a God who's more than just the Lord of history. He has entered and willingly become subject to its darkest forces. And so this is a passage we won't see this Sunday. We're going to look at Doubting Thomas. But the next week, we're going to look at multiple resurrection appearances for the next couple of weeks. But one of them is here on the Emmaus Road, that on Easter Sunday, a couple of the disciples are headed to a town called Emmaus, and Jesus appears, and they're dumbfounded because they're so disappointed. They wanted this Messiah to have come and destroyed the Romans and would have restored Israel to what they wanted Israel to be in its glory day. And what they didn't understand is Christ had to come and suffer before he takes his glory. There's a cross before there's glory. And because ultimately he has to defeat the greater enemy, which is not Rome, it's sin, and it's in all of us. And so they don't understand this. And Jesus, look at the strong words. This is on Easter Sunday. And they're confused. We thought he was the one, but he died. He says to them, "O foolish ones, and slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Was it not necessary that the Christ should suffer these things and enter into his glory?" And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them in all the scriptures the things concerning himself. So he was saying, this is the story. This is the story. I'm not an indifferent God to suffering. I have come to end all suffering because it all began with sin. So that's why he comes first to do that. In his second coming, the end of all things, the final enemy to be totally destroyed is death. And there will be no more pain and no more suffering anymore, but he had to take care of sin first. And so, again, what all this means, just kind of review. We have a God who is not exempt from suffering. He has willingly plunged himself into suffering. He's not a cold, uncaring king. And that helps us to know that he is, because he's not kept himself immune from suffering and our suffering, that we can trust him with our suffering. Because here's the other aspect of his suffering. Said this on Sunday. Love with parting is the most painful thing we'll ever experience in life. There's no doubt about it. And what we want more than anything else is love without parting. And death takes it away from us. Death causes us to have love that is parted. And the more you love someone, the more it hurts. And not only that, the more you love someone, when you see them suffer, it breaks your heart. Being a parent has been an eye-opener of just, I can remember, and I had to restrain myself from not interacting, seeing my kid get bullied by a kid from another neighborhood. We came over one day, and I watched it with my own eyes, and it made me so angry. But I felt like he needed to do that and learn how to sort that stuff out, and then I could talk to him later. And maybe that was the wrong choice. I don't know. But my point is it is far harder to watch those you love suffer. It's almost easier to deal with your own suffering than to watch those you love. And the more you love someone, the more it hurts. And that's what God the Father does. He sees us suffering. It hurts him. It grieves his spirit. It hurts his heart. Now, here's an interesting quote. I had to take a double take on this because I thought, what? Albert Camus said this. He was a French philosopher. I think he was an existentialist philosopher. He was a critic of Christianity. But look what he just says. He has reasoned out the reality of the gospel in this. Look what he says. He says, I'm not saying he became a Christian, but look what he says. He says, in that Christ has suffered voluntarily. Suffering was no longer unjust. If everything without exception in heaven and earth is doomed to pain and suffering, then a strange form of happiness is possible. And so, what he's saying is when Christ came to suffer, he also came to satisfy justice for the consequence of sin. And so he's willingly and done that voluntarily. It means something we'll see as well next week, that our suffering is not purposeless. It's not without meaning or reason, and it also means it can also be redemptive. So again, it is always harder. So let's focus on God the Father, and understand, I think this is an important piece, and we'll see here in just a little bit in our interview, that it is so much. Let me back up. I think a lot of times we think of Jesus as the more loving member of the Trinity, more compassionate, and here's the cold, uncaring member of the Trinity, God the Father, who, has his son suffer, do the grunt work, do the hard work, and I think we miss in that. One, that is not true, but two, it is always harder to watch your children suffer. And we need to see that about God the Father, that if we just see him as this unemotional, distant deity, our suffering becomes so unbearable and it feels cruel. But we have to understand, he knows. God the Father suffered immensely having his son suffer. And here's Jesus. Here is Jesus. Think about this. He's crying for his Father, God the Father, in his suffering. And if Jesus is going to his Father with his pain, you can just think about, the temptation, Gethsemane, of course, the cross. He's bleeding Scripture. He is quoting his Father's words. He is crying to his Father with loud cries. He's doing that because he trusts his Father with his suffering. If Jesus Christ, trusts his Father in suffering, then we should trust our Heavenly Father in ours. And let's look at his suffering. God the Son, in his life, suffered, immensely. He's the suffering servant. And he suffered just even what it meant to be human, weariness, thirst, distress, grief. He was anxious and troubled in heart. When he prayed, he did pray with loud cries and tears. Jesus was misunderstood by friends, a family, in his hometown. I'm still kind of blown away that there's one point when Mary comes with, several of Jesus' brothers, and goes up to Galilee, and at the house they had, I think it was in Capernaum, where the disciples typically, kind of their residence, their base. And she's like, somebody go get him. He's out of his mind. Even his closest family members thought he was out of his mind. And then we cannot begin to understand what it was like for him to truly be just assaulted by the devil, and how much the devil enjoyed that. He was tempted by him and assaulted by the evil one. And then in his death, Jesus was abandoned by the people he poured his whole life into, denied. He spent his ministry pouring into them so they could carry on his work. And immediately, it took nothing for them just to, boom, walk away from him. And as we've talked about in the last couple of weeks, I think it's hard for us to understand, but the infinite cosmic agony that any of us really can understand of what it means to be in a perfect love relationship for all eternity, and in a way that's mysterious and hard to understand, but to not have that on the cross, and yet, I'm not saying that God the Father ceased to love his Son, but Christ, and it's a mystery to really behold, but the wrath of God was being poured on Christ in that moment. And he was cut off from his Father. in a way that's was like infinite amount of hells he was experiencing on the cross for the consequence for our sins. And so the ultimate suffering is what Keller says is the loss of love. And this was the loss of eternal perfect love that hard to understand this side of heaven. But he didn't have it in a way he had it before when he was on the cross. And then now Christ suffers. Think about this. This is an interesting one, and we'll look at this passage in maybe 3 weeks. I just want to continue to hit post-resurrection appearances, not just leave it for Easter to talk about the resurrection. But Saul, he's an ardent persecutor of Christ's church and zealous to kill. And Jesus stops him. And he says, Saul, why do you persecute me? Now, Jesus is in the state of glory. Okay, this is after the resurrection. And obviously he is in paradise. There's no suffering in heaven. But as we said earlier, when you love something and you watch what you love suffer, it pains your heart. So, Saul's never met Jesus before. What he knew about Jesus, he hated him, and he sought to snuff it out. He was persecuting human beings, though, not Jesus directly. But when Jesus confronts him, he says, why do you persecute me? Because when you're hurting my people, you're hurting me. This is my body. You're persecuting me, and it pains my heart. But here's the other thing, and this is so crucial about our suffering, is that it's a whole doctrine about being united to Christ. And one of the things we're united to Christ is when we suffer, we share in his Christ's sufferings. And I think it's only been until the last couple of years I've realized, like, there have been specific ways that I kind of, a lot of suffering in our lives and mine, it's like brought on by dumb things I've said, or poor leadership decisions, or, negligence, whatever, lack of wisdom, foolishness. But there are times that we just suffer. And we're victims. And that has certainly happened, and it happens to all of us. And I think in the last couple of years, I've come to realize, what does it mean? In the suffering, I've had this recognition, oh, I understand this more about you, Jesus. And I know that might sound weird, but it draws me closer to him. That I'm united to something he's experienced. And in that, it doesn't feel like, oh, this is cruel, I just have to suffer to learn something. It's like, okay, I'm understanding you now better in a way I didn't understand before, because I've gone through something very similar. But here's the other thing. We have fellowship with Christ in our suffering. He's in the flames with us. And you'll see that from our guests. There's just something supernatural that so often happens in our suffering, with the presence of Christ, that just can't experience until we've gone through suffering. And we learn Christ did from our suffering. We just see what he had to go through: betrayal, rejection, and that we experience that when we are united to him. Here's Keller again. He says, when believers in Jesus suffer, he is quite literally with us in our furnace of trouble, and in some way actually feeling the flames too. And that is just what we need more than anything else. When we suffer, if we do not believe that he's with us, if we think that he's cold and distant and uncaring, it becomes unbearable to endure suffering. And so next week, what we're going to look at is the reason for suffering. And we're going to take a stab at that. Is what can our suffering mean? We can't understand everything clearly, right? There's just some things, we've got all eternity to understand the why. And I'm looking forward to that, as we all do. But there are some things we can understand now. And I think one of them is, again, we must look back. Now, what I mean by Emmaus Road here is, look, this was prophesied, that Christ was going to suffer. And he was going to suffer immensely because of our sin. And this is the reality of post-Genesis 3, the fall, that our sin has brought in and ushered this whole era that we were not meant for. I constantly keep saying over and over, we were not meant for the wilds outside of Eden. And we were meant for love never to be taken from us. But because of sin, has radically changed all that. So we must look back and see that Christ was supposed to suffer and that he did suffer for us. 2, we also must see now in our suffering that he's with us. He's with us in the flames, and he's not indifferent. And he is feeling what we feel, feeling our suffering. Because if you love someone, when they suffer, it breaks your heart. So we must understand that's how he feels about us when we're suffering, when we're in the furnace. But we also must look ahead. We mentioned that the last couple of weeks. We must see the future glory and grab hold of it now. We're told we're citizens of heaven now in a way that is amazing to understand. But grabbing something that is future and bringing it into our present reality so it informs. And that even when we're in the state of glory one day, when we're in the presence of God, and when heaven and earth are reconciled into one thing, and there is no more suffering, there's a way in which, though, I believe we look back at our suffering and can, with redemptive lens, and can understand it better. All right, and we'll close with this last quote, and we'll bring in our guest. Keller says, so while Christianity never claims, So while Christianity never claims to be able to offer a full explanation of all God's reasons behind every instance of evil and suffering, it does have a final answer to it. And that answer will be given at the end of history, and all who hear it and see its fulfillment will find it completely satisfying, infinitely sufficient. All right, let's take a pause, and we'll bring in our guest here in just a second. Well, we are now joined with our guest this evening, and I just want to stop and say it's going to be hard. And this is a very sacred thing when any of you who have joined us or planning to join us, like, you're offering an amazing gift. I think one of the challenges of suffering, it's just when you're in it, it just feels like no one can understand and relate, and that's just hard. And the reality is we can't, unless we've been through the same thing. And even when we've been through the same thing, it doesn't always mean we understand, because everybody processes grief differently. But it is a real privilege to hear from our guests this evening. This is Pat Mindock. She's been here since probably the earliest days. I think, 2010. Was it Derek that drug you in here? Yeah. She says she's a kin of Derek, which I know you've explained it to me at least 4 or 5 times. I still get confused, but I know it's related to, I think Kenny's your cousin. Is that right? Okay. So Kenny Stipe, who attends here as well, as Derek's father. But this also has to, this affects Derek, because Derek was really close with Josh. And Josh was Pat's son, and he passed in March of 2015. And so just want to encourage you, we're going to take our time slowly through this, but it's also a wonderful opportunity to honor him. So I'm going to step aside, and now Pat's going to take over.
Okay.
You can look at me if you want, instead of feel like you have to look at the camera.
All right.
But I'm glad you came here, and I know your internet is terrible.
It's terrible.
Home, so this makes it a lot easier. But I'm just, it's a real privilege, and like I just was saying. And so thank you for offering us, because this is really vulnerable and it's sacred. This is your story.
Yeah.
And maybe that's where we should start is, tell us your story. Like, what happened?
My son, Josh, he was really special, and he was a devoted son and family guy, Christian. One of the kids that organized everybody else to rally around the flagpole in 10th grade, 11th grade, leader in football. Everybody just really looked up to him. He was a really strong guy. He could bench press 700 pounds with his legs. I mean, he was really strong, and his trainer that he loved, he said he was his favorite one, because he was the only one that could fight him. He was the only one that he could take on. that he felt like he could do something with. That was Josh, tall and deep voiced and kind and thoughtful and loving. He got hurt in football. He, as time progressed, it was his shoulders. It just kept getting worse and worse. He had a torn labrum in his shoulder. When he finally got a job where he could get health insurance that would cover his surgery. That was in 2009. And in 2009, he was so excited because he had this great job. He was making good money, and he finally could get his shoulder fixed. So he went, had surgery, found a doctor. I'm not going to name any of them, but I would never recommend them if anybody ever asks. He found a doctor in Asheville. Well, the practice was here, but the doctor that worked on him was in Asheville. They did the surgery, and he said he would be fine in 6 weeks, and time kept going on, and Josh was just in terrible pain all the time. And he was always hurting. It wasn't getting any better. And when he would go back to the doctor and say, my shoulder is not getting better, the doctor would just say, I couldn't have possibly done anything wrong. I'm sure you just want more drugs. You need to just tough it out. Time kept going by, and Josh wasn't getting any better. So he went to the head of the practice and said, look, I'm not getting better. Anyway, they worked it out. Instead of me going to a different practice, which we should have done, I should have found him a different doctor, but I didn't. They used another doctor in the same practice. He also botched the surgery. In the meantime, Josh is on more and more painkillers all the time. He had a third surgery after a period of a couple of years, maybe a year and a half, 2 years. He finally had a third surgery with a doctor in Tennessee who said, your shoulder is a mess. The anchors are loose. Your internal muscles are torn. He had to detach the bicep to move it down his arm. It was just awful. And Josh was becoming more and more and more addicted to the painkillers. At the time, I didn't know that. I didn't know that he couldn't kick it on his own. I didn't know.
Nobody did.
Nobody knew. In 2015, nobody really knew that he couldn't make it on his own. So he tried, and he stayed in his house one time for 8 days with his girlfriend with him, trying to break the addiction. He thought he succeeded, and so did we, because we didn't know you couldn't do that. So anyway, it was a back and forth thing. And he decided in 2013 that he was going to go to California. Now, on hindsight, of course, I know why. I didn't at the time, but he was smoking pot as well to dull the pain in his arm. And he just kept doing it. He went out there. Well, long story short, it wasn't a good situation. He wasn't around people that were helping him. But he wasn't doing the hard stuff then. He did give in to temptation. He did get some heroin. He stuck it in his arm. And because he was not doing it for a while, the coroner told me that he just used too much and it just put him to sleep. And then I got the phone call that night, March 4th. So it was the day after my daughter got married. So if you want to know about him, he was a wonderful guy. He was so helpful to everybody. He was kind. He would stop on the side of the road just to help somebody that he saw was in trouble. He was so loyal to his friends. Every single friend he had could call on him for anything, and he would be there to help. And he loved his mama. And I'm sorry this is what took him out. I would pray every single day, Lord, please help him. Please, you love him more than I do. I know you do, and I know how much I love him, so help him And he did. He helped him, not the way I wanted him to be helped, but he helped him. He rescued him. He got him out of the addiction. And that's the only way I can look at it, because it's just what I felt in my heart. Like, I know that he got him out of that horrible situation that he was in out there and took him home. Josh just wasn't meant for this world, I don't think. I'm not sure. But anyway, sorry.
Well, I think it was at that night we were at your house, and I remember seeing a picture of you and him at Lake Summer.
Yeah.
And I just remember seeing and just feeling the suffocation of suffering, of just the finality of death, of just trying to process that all.
It is suffocating.
Yeah.
You can't breathe.
Yeah.
You can't think. You can't really do anything. But I must have cried every day for, I don't know, a year and a half. If it wouldn't have been for my sister-in-law listening to me wail on the phone to her, God bless her, to put up with me doing that every single day, or my brother calling me, doing it with him. I mean, I literally would speak to them and just sob because I couldn't breathe. It is a terrible thing.
Yeah, I think, as you were just saying, I think the hard part about his death is sometimes that can define the story of Josh, but there's such a fulsome picture that I keep getting more of it, just hearing Derek tell stories about them growing up together, because they weren't that far apart.
No, they were. Well, they were only a few days apart age, and they were one of their best friends in school, and they did all kinds of stuff together.
Yeah.
They really loved each other, and they were close. Derek was good, and Josh was good with them both.
And I think, though I never met Josh, I think the thing I most appreciate about him through the years, and just hearing you tell stories, is how fiercely loyal he was to you.
He was.
Yeah, and in fact, I think one of my favorite stories, though, is fierce loyalty, because the one thing I heard more than anything at the service was the word kind.
Very.
I mean, you could see brute strength, just from pictures and just what you described, 700 pounds.
Bench pressing with his leg. Yeah, leg pressing. I meant leg pressing, not bench pressing with his legs.
No, you said leg pressing, which is still ridiculous. But I think that word kind, but there was somebody who, and I don't know who it was, she got up and told a story about how Josh had literally, some bad guy was trying to ruin her life, and he stepped in.
He did.
And literally he scared this guy so much, he drove him out of the state. Like literally, followed him till he left.
That was
the
him.
State. That is amazing.
That was him.
I love that.
He was very loyal. As a matter of fact, I feel awful for Tasha, because she had some of his things. She still does. And honestly, I haven't had I have not been able to go get them. Jessie can't even get the stuff in her basement that's sitting there, because and we know it's final. That's not it. It's just seeing his stuff brings back so much.
Yeah.
I need to do it. I just haven't been able to. I promise I will. But if she doesn't have it anymore, it's okay. It's just stuff.
Yeah.
It doesn't really matter. But yes, he was loyal. When I think of Josh, above all other things, I think kind. I always have. One time he threw a stone. He was just throwing stones at little birds, and he hit the bird, and he killed the bird. And I thought he was 6 years old, but he was devastated that he killed the bird. And he was a good guy. He really was. People looked up to him. He was a leader in this horrible. But it's made me see how God steps in and takes care of you. when you just can't take care of yourself.
Yeah, tell me more about that, because I've seen it in all these 5 years now, of just you describing the love of Christ in a powerful way.
You feel it physically. The night he died, I was devastated. I couldn't even think. But when I laid down and I prayed, Jesus, I can't even think. It was like I just felt like he wrapped his arms around me and just held me till I went to sleep, because I just wasn't able to. I could never have done it. There's things I never could have done. The week after Josh passed, I had to find a mortician in California. How was I supposed to do that? Who do I call? There was no one to call. I know God led me to this kind man. Carmine Romano was his name. I don't think I'll ever forget it. Kind, loving man that helped me with my son in ways I never could have ever asked. I didn't have to ask for anything. I didn't have to think about doing anything. The man just stepped in and helped me, and God blessed me and thanked me. I thanked him. But I could never have done that. I never could have. I don't remember much of people here, or, you just, I remember some, but a lot of it is blurry. But God helped me do so many things that I never could have done it myself ever. And I think what helps so much is knowing Jesus knew what I was going through. He knew the struggle and the suffering and the pain. He knew it. And the fact that he knew it meant I wasn't alone in it. That just meant everything to me.
He was in the furnace with you.
He was.
That's what we were just doing in the lesson. And you've read the book too.
Yeah, twice.
Yeah, it was a real minister to you.
It was. I have a notebook, a Facebook note back from Mr. Keller.
That's right.
That's right.
Yeah,
I'm never going to delete it off.
He wrote, yeah.
He did. He did.
Yeah.
And I don't know.
What about, one of the things too we were just covering in the chapter is the whole chapter was the suffering of God, and I think it was chapter 7. And, one of the things that's always been, sometimes it can feel to people that God the Father is distant, but then Jesus is the nice one. It's an ancient heresy. But what often comes to it, even in that, is today it still feels like to people like, well, God the Father, he's cold and distant, and Jesus had to do all the hard suffering. And I think what gets lost in that is the pain. There's no greater pain on this earth than losing a child.
No, there isn't. There isn't.
And it's certainly everybody's worst fear.
It is.
You've been it.
I lived that fear for a long time, thinking I was going to lose my son. I was afraid. And then it happened. And, I have to say, I have never one time blamed Jesus, not once. Never once. Never blamed God, not one time. But I often look at my life and think, not one thing that I planned when I was young is happening in my life. So you have to, well, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Because when you're young, you have plans, you have dreams. Grandchildren. I didn't have any of that. And that's heartbreaking, but it is the way it is. And, all those things, you have to put it all in. You end up having, either you let it take you out or you put it in perspective. And my perspective is I'm going to do my best to help as many people as I can if they need me. I'm going to get through this life as best as I can because there's a lot of good stuff waiting for me later.
Yeah.
And, you know, I'll do the best I can with what I got.
Yeah. This is something that this is a conversation we've had many a time, is about the hope of future glory.
Yes.
So you just said almost all all these plans you had for life.
Yeah.
And that's the reality for, so many. I mean, like,
it is.
This is what life looks like outside the Garden of Eden.
Yes.
It's suffering is normative.
And I think you're bound to ask questions. Why is my life so weird and other people have such a normal life? I don't know I'm not going to know the answer to that question. I just have to roll with it because I don't know why my life is not like other people's. Some people that you look at, their life is normal. They have a lot of family, they go and have, so I don't know. I'm not going to know here. And then when I get there, I just won't care. I'll be too happy it won't matter.
But but the promise is restoration of things. It's not this.
Well, I'll have a big giant family up there.
Yeah, I mean, what I've heard you say that one thing that frustrates you is that the genes in your family cause long life, and you're like, I may have.
Dang.
30 years.
I may have 30 more years.
This,
Yeah, because
really
my dad just passed at 92 last week. My one aunt lived to 96. My other aunt lived to 89. My other aunt, let me see, my other uncle lived to 92. I have an uncle now that's 89. Okay. Well,
I've never heard anybody say that before, but it makes so much sense. And yet I kind of sense that it's not, you're not just wanting to escape.
No.
That you're just, that hope is carrying you today.
Yes.
In this life.
Yes. I believe that's what it is.
Yeah.
It carries me. I'm not wanting to just run out and jump off a bridge or something, but I know that I have a future to look forward to. And I'm not afraid to die. Like Billy Graham would say, it's not being dead, it's the dying that bothers me. Yeah, I can understand that. But I said jump off the bridge. I laughed many years ago when my nephews were up, Josh and the nephews decided to go down to Lake Summit, and they would climb the top of that iron bridge and jump off. And I have pictures of Josh saying, come on, let's go, and he'd climb up all the way up to the top of that bridge and jump off. I think they patrol it better now, but they didn't at the time. So he was pretty fearless.
Yeah. And you are too.
Oh,
that's very good.
I don't know. I don't think of myself that way. I'm better than I used to be. There are still some things I won't do, but in some ways I'm braver than I used to be. I can say that.
We'll close with this. What's the one? This is a tough question. You said you had that fear.
Yeah, I did.
And there's several folks in church who have been through the same thing. Your story.
Yes.
And so that fear was there before it happened.
Yes.
But what do you want us to know about Christ being with you in the furnace? Know that when your worst fear comes true.
Well, you're not going to die right then, even though you want to, even though you feel like, I think I just want to die. The pain is so great, you just don't want to live. You just don't. And if I didn't have Christ holding my hand, holding me, and keeping me together, I probably would not have made it through this. There's no way. When you love somebody as much as I love Josh, and I know he loved me, you have to realize that there is somebody who loves both of us more. And I have to remember who the boss is, and it's not me. And that's not easy, because you want to be the boss. Everybody wants to, but you don't get to. And I'm not saying I was all like, oh yeah, this, I can accept this. I had a lot of whys, and I wailed a lot because I prayed all the time for my son to be better. And when he died, it was really hard, but like I said, I kept saying, I'm not the boss. I'm not the boss. My prayer to you, Lord, was, you love him more than I do, so you have to do what you have to do. And quite honestly, when I got that call that night, I was wailing and devastated, but there was inside of me this, I know where he is. I know where he is. And that meant everything. It's what gave me the ability to keep going. Because I knew he was safe, finally.
Yeah, well done. I cannot thank you enough.
Sorry.
Please do not apologize. And I think it's good for people to know and see what you're still going through, because you just said something, before we started. You said, I'm happy to talk about Josh. You know what? Not many people ask me anymore.
Yeah.
And it's been 5 years. And
sure, it's natural. I understand that. Right.
But I know that name, Josh, is a name you want to keep talking about and keep hearing that name. And I appreciate you telling us about Josh.
Oh my goodness. He was very, very much like his granddaddy.
Yeah.
They were so much alike.
Yeah.
A little goofy, never starting a fight, but if one was started, they finished it well, and they always took up for the weaker person. Josh always did that.
A justice fighter.
And he was, and my dad was the same way. So they were so alike, and that's why Josh loved his granddaddy so much.
He was his hero.
He was. Yeah. He was his hero.
Yeah.
So I have two of the most important men in my life up there now, together. Didn't know that was going to happen, but they're skipping, dancing, and happy now. So what do I have to say about that?
Well, thank you so much. I know it's been hard too with this whole pandemic.
Yes.
We haven't even been able to have
I haven't had service for him, and I want to so much, but I can wait if I have to.
Yeah,
so
and he's a man worthy of tremendous honor. There are a lot of stories to be told.
Yes, there are.
Marlboro man looks up to him. Dean, that's for sure.
What a great man he was.
Yeah,
I loved him so.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much.
Okay.
And let me turn this off.
Thank you.
And then you and I can hang out. But, I thank you so much for joining us, folks. And again, just thank you so much for joining us. We love you so much. And so we'll see you next week, everybody.